I was wondering if you could say more about how your work goes about like when you talk about your work confronting the other or allowing people the opportunity to confront another, I wonder if you could elaborate on that point and maybe talk about kind of the mechanics of that and how the presence of art or the act of creating art facilitates that process of confronting another person, how it changes the situation from, say, how we're sitting here right now, how a project like one of the ones that you would work on changes the situation to.
I think when I talk about confronting the other, means that you actually, you bring your own desires about what it is, what you would want in life, and try to risk that in the face of another in order to understand what you have to be able to let go to create common ground. So confronting the other is basically also the capability of letting go of some of your own desire in order to come to a common understanding or a common or a collective desire for the change of a certain place. So confronting the other is really actually an exercise of letting go of some of your own ideas and pre-assumption about what it is, for instance, that you want to achieve. So, and for me that has to do with what I call risking one's subjectivity.
Would you say it's almost, maybe this is kind of a strange way to put it, but it almost sounds like with risking your subjectivity and kind of expressing those desires, it almost sounds like a confession. And in the kinds of situations that you create, you're inviting people to confess. Is confession the wrong word to use there? But something about the way you were describing the process struck me as kind of in this process of letting go of subjectivity, but it also entails expressing that subjectivity, expressing your own perspective, but at the same time relinquishing it.
Yes. So, and I don't think that is a matter of confessing, but it's exactly what you is expressing your identity, your self-interest, while at the same time in expressing it to somebody else, having the will or the willingness of letting go of some of it in order to make room for the expression of other people's interests. Mm-hmm. And this is for me, is a very active field that has that is between people. That is actually what I think is what one means with interest, being in between, but it's also being interested in the opinion of the other, and bringing your own opinion or your own ideas into that field or into that space, into that in between, but at the same time leaving room for some of the other ideas and confront them with each other.
So in a process, I'm thinking of a project like Two Up, Two Down in Liverpool. So the process of confronting I don't want to say confronting sounds so confrontational, right? Which isn't necessarily. I mean, I don't want to frame it in a negative way, but in confronting the other. That happens, it seems that would happen on two levels with something like Two Up, Two Down, amongst the people working on the project together, trying to realize this idea together, but then that kind of leads to my next question, because you were also confronting the municipality who were trying to tear down this neighborhood. So, and here we are back on script, but when you're trying to confront a government or an institution, are they the other, and how do you engage? How can you effectively engage with with a faceless other? If it's fair to categorize, say, the government of Liverpool as the other in the situation, or maybe you would say that it's some other kind of entity.
Yeah, and I always like to call it the powers to be, because they have many faces, many incarnations. Let's say that. I think those processes maybe go a little bit more towards, like almost creating a political stance in this case. But you could say that some of it, of course, goes through the same kind of process. It's trying to, it's not engage into a conversation with the powers to be, and this conversation not necessarily has to be a field of negotiation, but because then you normally go into negotiation or diplomacy or this kind of thing. But I think it's trying to find ways to really engage into a confrontation, to engage into a conversation about exactly the conditions in which that meeting or that conversation takes place. And I think it's also there where I find it very important that these conditions that can hold this confrontation needs to be shaped. So this confrontation is not just because I'm not agreeing with you, that's not a confrontation. The fact that you can let go of your own subjectivity in relation to the other, to confront the other, this also needs to happen in an area of trust. And there's trust needed for that. So this is not a field, a neutral field where no, this is not something that you just can, it's not just running up to another opinion.
Right, sure.
It's trying to create conditions in which that process of confrontation can happen, which means, and also can lead to meaningful negotiations. I think that was why I was talking this paper, because I think one of the thinkings and the writings about this letting go of the one's subjectivity that I've been thinking about writing about is that we should return to the point zero. That's basically where the moment where the I ends and the other begins. Perhaps it's there that meaning can be formed. So in this confrontation, meaning could be formed through the interaction of constantly changing practices and activity. And if such a point is actually reached, it goes without saying that experience can never be directed and singular. Experience emerges because of the color of different intersubject aesthetic sense-oriented systems. The shared experience within which we come into being and come aware of being will lead to a much more pluriform world of meaning. This is also a quote of Scott Lash from the theory of the image, but what is important there is that he says that this, let's say, this space of confrontation or this interaction is something that only happens through constantly changing practice and activity. So it's something that you have to practice. And it also, when it forms meaning through constantly changing practice and activities, then experiences will emerge. So he says it's a space that's not only a space in where you trust to go there, to have that confrontation, but it's also that you have to practice that confrontation. So it's not something that's just it's just running up against what we talked about, a power, but it's about practicing how you can basically build something together and use that in order to then use that as a way to create new meaning and to create a kind of force on the ground or a new commonality. So I think with the powers to be, you have to try to engage in the same kind of conversation and to de-abstract the powers to be and to ask them also to engage in that kind of like practice and meaningful conversation. Now that's, I think, quite the most difficult thing to do, because the way I think about this, that is exactly how power is exercised, by the abstraction of space, or by creating or not allowing the space for that kind of like confrontation to happen. So how can you
cultivate like an arena? It's like you have to create this arena for it to take place. I wonder, like, could you imagine a world in which like people of Liverpool start building this bakery and responding to their situation, expressing their needs to the municipality, is there a world in which the municipality responds with art? Maybe that's a ridiculous question, but is that the ideal situation? That all the conversation is happening? I mean, I totally, this is out of the blue and I didn't email you about this beforehand. But I thought of it and I'm curious.
No, I think what you already see, what is happening is that at least the council as it is now is engaging in a conversation about the possibility. What you see at the other hand is of course that it runs against its own mechanisms. Like, you know, for instance, because this demolition order is already given, it's very hard for them to take it back. Because, you know, these are systems in which regulation and redlining and zoning is made like 10 years in advance, and permits are given, and the whole, you know, the whole technocratic machinery that goes with it is already running. So, and for them, it's very hard to take that back, because they do not know how to do that. But that is something, I think, that what I mean, what this conversation might be capable of holding, is that how can we learn together to not only, you know, change these kind of processes, but also take certain of these things back. You know, and you see that the council already wants and feels and engage in this conversation. They do not know how yet to backtrack, to step back, and to, you know, to backtrack. So if they would respond with art, I don't know. I hopefully they respond with the fact that they are also actively looking for the possibilities to change the conditions in which some of these conversations in the future can be held. And I think that's very important. So in that sense, that they've also become somebody who steps into that very carefully and still very fragile space that the community built, and become also an active participant. Right. So, and for that they might need to step back and backtrack some of their own decision-making processes. And maybe sometimes say, like, maybe our first ideas were stupid. Or acknowledge the failing of their own scheme. But these are very hard things to do, and that has to do also with, you know, that I said, if you confront yourself with another, this might also lead to the fact that you have to acknowledge the fact that you have to maybe change your own perspective on things. So, yeah, hopefully they will.
But it's certainly more difficult to get.
Of course, official structures, because they have very ingrained, like we all, very ingrained ways of doing things. And especially if they are over time, they are, you know, formalized and bureaucratized to a level that nobody feels personally responsible for it anymore. So this abstraction, I think, is very very hard to handle. And this is also what sometimes for most people feel left out. It's what I say, people feel there's a big disconnect, because people feel left out, because they feel there's no way they can sort of in one way or another take part in it, because it's an abstraction, and in that sense it doesn't relate to their immediate condition. So I think it's breaching or breaking that abstraction into a space in which you can renegotiate the different desires and that are at play.
Right, and actually have a reciprocal conversation rather than the government handing down, like, okay, this is how it's going to be.
Yeah.
Right. When you're creating artistically, in your talk you talked about the courage of creation, and I was wondering if you could maybe just, how would you say it compares, like how does courage in creation manifest itself? Is it only in the act of creation, or are there other, how would you say that courage is present throughout the creative process, and how does it shape what the end result of what you produce as an artist? Or is it, is it comparable to another kind of courage that you could think of, or is it something of its own?
Point to fly this one on, so that's why I'm thinking.
I can try to. I know.
No, I don't. I think you know, like, you know, if you think about political courage or moral courage, which you know there are different ways to think about courage. I think. I think the way I see it like that, to be able to give an image to the way you see yourself in the world, I think that is something that is very important, and to imagine the possibility of the confrontation to another, and to imagine the possibility of yourself as somebody that could act in that space. In the space of sorry, to be in that space of for the to even imagine yourself in the sense of the courage to be, you know, to be or to imagine that. I think that in itself is a creative act. So, and that's not something that belongs to the arts. That to produce an understanding of yourself in relation to the world and to others in itself is a creative act. So that is something that I think we should all practice. And I don't see that as let's say the domain of the artist or something like that, but I understand that the artist maybe by training has a certain skill set, like, you know, thinking can also be a needed skill set for some of these processes. So I think that, you know, the act of creating is also a skill set. So to learn about it is very important.